It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here and to introduce our speaker for tonight, Robert Gribben. Robert is very well known among us and is one of our very eminent chapter colleagues here in AAL Victoria. Robert is possibly Australia's greatest ecumenist, or if not, very nearly. Robert has been a minister in the Uniting Church of Australia, has been a teacher in theological colleges in Australia and the UK. His involvement in ecumenical dialogue is absolutely mind-blowingly expansive. In my time as convener, Robert has worked on papers that he's mentioned to me in relation to Methodist dialogue with Baptists, including writing a theological paper on Baptists' theologies of baptism as a Methodist. Robert is with us tonight to speak on the topic Eucharistic absence. And this is a very timely and interesting paper that I'm sure will provoke a fair amount of reflection and discussion. Many of us who are ministering in Christian community or are members of Christian community or find ourselves on the edges of Christian community have found the last 6 months particularly challenging. For those of us in the Catholic tradition, the inability to have public masses has raised questions about access to sacraments and how we can help people to lead the lives supported by sacramental worship and particularly access to the Eucharist that is so fundamental to how we approach the working out of our discipleship. Social media has been very animated with discussions about, can I bring a bit of wine and a bit of bread to my screen when Eucharist is being celebrated on Zoom and still participate in communion? Responses to this vary, and the conditions under which these responses originate are as varied as the people having these experiences. Robert will be pursuing a very particular line about Eucharistic presence and Eucharistic absence, and I hope it will be thought-provoking and possibly prayer-provoking for us all. So please welcome Robert, and I look forward to hearing the reflections after his paper.
Is it being recorded, Kieran?
It is being recorded.
So we'll be able to get a copy?
Yes, you will, most certainly. Now, if you just hang on one moment, I'm going to spotlight Robert. I'm going to mute everybody and unmute Robert so that he can speak. Thank you, Robert.
Well, Mr. Convener, members of the Australian Academy of Liturgy, my dear peers, and invited guests, whom I'm very touched to see, brothers and sisters in Christ. This is a liturgical consideration of the question of online communion. One could do a biblical one, or a systematic theology one, or a sacramental theology one, and there are bits of that in what I want to say. But basically it's the liturgy and the defense of the liturgy which animates me. It'll be a Uniting Church presentation with an open ecumenical hand, because it involves issues, as Kieran has just said, for all of us. But the Uniting Church is where I stand, and the Uniting Church is the church with whom I am having an argument. In early April of this year, the Uniting Church's Assembly Standing Committee, which is our authoritative body in between the full meetings of the Assembly, which is a national council, considered our present position vis-à-vis worship and, quote, given these extreme circumstances, end quote, permitted Holy Communion to be celebrated as part of online worship with no viewer communion possible, and further allowed the option of using bread and wine prepared at home. It provided a background paper, a good one. It's notable, because I've looked up the commentaries, including the one by Darcy, that the basis of union, which is our governing document, really gives us no help whatsoever in this situation. It's a bit early, actually, in our denominational history, a bit over 40 years, for us to have formed a uniting theological basis, really, for anything. We still have the traditions of the three uniting churches, and we have been, I think, particularly blessed by ecumenical explorations. The biting question for the uniting church is whether we actually have any doctrine on which we would take a stand. There are some advantages in discussing this matter online at this stage. We've all done our best to live through one of the greatest spiritual absences of our lives. We've tuned in to see how others are doing, coveting some people's gifts in front of a camera or a microphone. We've learned what satisfies and what does not, and we long for the familiar. Not that we haven't discovered some valuable lessons in the experience. Our former colleague Brian Cohn has pointed some out. Zoom wonderfully replaces the backs of the heads in the pew in front of us as a visible sign of the gathered assembly. We see faces, we can greet each other, we're aware that we have a common purpose. It allows a wide number of people to take part in the liturgy, a big plus, through joint responses, though, as we've just discovered, joint responses and hymn singing can feel odd, on or off mute. A medium which does not augment singing is no friend of liturgy. It would be good if the presider managed to be off camera, except for his or her particular role. For a service of the word, Zoom has definite possibilities, yet its inevitable remoteness, its happening at a remove, is an inescapable problem. The great principle we all learned from the Second Vatican Council and its Sacrosanctum Concilium is of our, quote, full, conscious and active participation in the liturgy. It's hard to think of a liturgical principle more welcome to Protestants. Participation, of course, is not merely mental interaction. Hold that thought. Brian says his congregation's asking how they can continue their working by this principle, quote, without meeting in person. He adds, an even greater challenge is posed by another liturgical principle. The primary symbol of the liturgy is the gathered assembly itself, which refracts grace in its gathering and movement, its word and song, its washing in baptism, its sharing in the Eucharistic meal at the common table. In the absence of actual bodies, such a symbol seems impossible, end quote. But it does have to do with our bodies and with all five senses. The doctrines of the incarnation and of redemption demand a human body. The Word of God himself embodied. The Holy One transfixed to a cross. Gordon Lathrop even applies the word carnality to the Eucharist. The washing of baptism unites all our bodies in the body of Christ, the Church. The sacrament of the Eucharist is not merely quoting and copying Jesus at the Last Supper, but a full-blooded anamnesis, a remembering of the whole of salvation history from the man and woman once enfleshed out of dust. This is the plenum, the fullness of full conscious and active participation. So where the liturgy dismembers these things, fragments the assembly, the ecclesia, the gathering together, the integrity of the faith is under threat. And we've done it, of course, often in our histories, and now there have been times where we've attempted to reform ourselves in the diverse Protestant families of the 16th century and at Trent, and a great deal of it more recently through the twin liturgical and ecumenical movements. Now, with most of what I've said so far about the faith and sacrament, I suspect that you've all agreed. But, quote, a submicroscopic infectious agent that replicates only inside the living cells of an organism, like the human body, has brought us undone. That was the medical definition of a virus. It has in fact attacked the whole of humankind, robbing us all equally of our most distinctive characteristic as human beings, community. The world, as St. John might have called it, has to deal with that, and it brings its skills mostly in medical science. But the church too brings its gift to preserve its own life, its koinonia, and it needs to watch very carefully which are the world's tool and which are our own. Ecumenically, we have learned so much about the nature and celebration of the liturgy over these past 50 years. We've composed new texts and new music. We've refreshed our language. The whole world of symbol and anamnesis have been recovered. We've seen the balance of word and sacrament regained. But with COVID-19, it seems as if we had never learned anything. For the liturgy too is a living organism. That should warn us about linking it to electronic media, to machines. But we've done it innocently for our life of worship. I want to argue that the media are so flawed as a vehicle for sacramental use that the Uniting Church's options are a step too far and a break with the Catholic tradition, which, by the way, I share with Kieran. We probably still lack a theology of technology. It appears hither and yon. But here's an example. The late Aidan Kavanagh, in his book Elements of Rite, a handbook on liturgical style, is strong medicine, quoted with a wry smile in liturgical circles, especially at Societas. He was a great character. But he draws a line in the sand. He wrote 40 years ago, but it was pertinent about 40 seconds ago. His comments are just as pertinent as ever. The wrong side of a record, an inverted slide, a broken film or tape, all put the assembly's worship at hazard. More fundamentally, however, he writes, resorting to electronic devices confuses vastly different types of communication. Ritual activity is a cool medium, which, and he's smiling when he says this, which seduces people into celebrative freedom of common activity. By comparison, electronic media are hot and tend to shove people into corners of passivity or isolation where they are manipulable by unseen wills, end quote. So in our context, the substitution of electronic media for everything we do in worship is perilous. In using them, we run the risk of borrowing their distortion of words, which in the public sphere are used to manipulate, or spin, or sell, or promote, or convince, or denigrate, or deceive. I spent, I suppose, about 15 years working with the Christian Television Association. We tried very hard on screen to separate evangelization from selling soap powder. The 15-second or 30-second little pictures, little cartoons, which we developed, had the simple purpose of keeping the rumor of God alive on public television. And pointing to where God might be found, we always finished in your local church. They were our best answer. They weren't terribly impressive, but a good experience. But getting the sacrament through the media, even to believers, is another task altogether. Now, some of you might have had a chance to see the video with Tom O'Loughlin and Carmel Pilcher and Joseph Grayland. Thomas described how many ways that we have actually learned to communicate virtually with benefit. But he says there are limits to virtuality at this particular point of the Eucharist. Or even a pub meal with a pint is best drunk with a mate. He asks whether it's possible to express love to someone virtually without their bodily presence. Joe Grayland noted the discovery that we can watch the Mass while having coffee or knitting, because we're removed from the usual context which carries with it customs, rules of courtesy, where we would not do that. And we lose all the sounds and the smells and the movement which marks a healthy human gathering, not to say also those visual things which evoke prayer and thought and faith. The very liturgical furniture, the central cross or crucifix, an icon, vestments, the glow of candles, the whiff of incense, all these every week in a uniting church, the familiar building, its memorials, the sound of the singers and the organ and the instrument, and so much more. Intangible in many ways, but contributory to the experience of worship which we are missing. The meme, which popped up at the start, points to one of the most important of these limitations. The fact that anything on screen makes us spectators and thus less than full participants. Now, I want to focus for a moment on the one great leap backwards, liturgically speaking, of our present time, the role of the clergy. I'd prefer to say leaders of worship, but you know who I mean. Robert Hovder's essential book on presiding, Strong, Loving and Wise, argues for what he calls a whole new job description for the presider. We've worked to rediscover the ecclesial nature of liturgy. We have tried a shift in perspective. Quote, the church comes first, the community of faith comes first, the assembly of the baptized comes first, and the fundamental reality of ministry is the ministry of the entire servant church. Specific ministries ordained, commissioned, or simply recognized in the community depend on the church and not vice versa. So we have welcomed the baptized back into the leadership of the liturgy. Those responsible for worship, and I hope there are always more than one, look out for good voices, male, female, adult, child, differently abled to proclaim the scriptures. People who know the needs of the world firsthand to prepare our intercessions. Assistants in our ritual roles with the graces suited to them. The presider, having carefully avoided that so easily exploited leadership of a president, the presider is freed to worship with the assembly of the baptized of which he or she is first a member. But suddenly in mid-March, we forgot all we had learned and somewhat unjustly expected the clergy to find ways of maintaining the worship life of our congregations. One result has been the videos of a presbyter alone in an empty church building trying to recreate the normal. And more shockingly, I think it began to occur to us in the first few weeks how few are the resources for personal or public prayer alive among our people. No parson, no church. Now, the teaching behind all that I've been saying has been largely a Roman Catholic scholarly gift, but there have been 50 years for the rest of us to read the matter for ourselves as separated churches, enriching where our own traditions, insights can be recovered or enhanced, or judiciously borrowing. Uniting Worship, the prayer book of the Uniting Church, and not to say all current Anglican or Lutheran texts, bear the fruit of the ecumenical discussions in the Australian Consultation on Liturgy. The same is true at the international level, nation by nation. Whether the congregations have benefited from this scholarship and insight has depended on whether they were taught it by the clergy, or whether it was available for learning even in seminaries, now as much lay schools as clerical schools. We have gotten ourselves into our present position because the liturgy has not got out to the people. We could start by returning the planning of music to an ecclesial, a genuinely communal responsibility. Yes, to a committee, one with the relevant charisms. Let me reiterate just one or two, actually 5, core points, about a sentence each. First, again, apart from separating the celebrant from the assembly, the focus in the media is inappropriately on a presider alone. Film no liturgy where the presider is not outnumbered by the active baptized. 2, all the charisma and action of the presider on screen cannot replace direct human communication. 3, an empty building is both a negative symbol and unattractive. 4, as in the meme, liturgy is not a spectator sport. And 5, the liturgy is an organism. It has its own life. It has an ordo. A couple of detailed examples. A videoed liturgy separates assembly and presider and separates the assembly from itself. If it is live streamed, it at least connects people in time, but not in space. If it's a recording, as in YouTube, the disjunction is in both time and space. And those two dimensions are key indices of reality. Second, well, what about the Uniting Church's final option? A family or friends at home with the bread and wine they have prepared and gathered in such a way that they can see a computer or a television screen. The Uniting Church, as do other churches, has guidelines as to who presides and who receives. Baptized children are included. What kind of bread and wine, and how the elements are handled and disposed of. If this current practice continues, current crisis continues, I should say, and by the way, the Uniting Church has placed a time limit of next March on this particular option, the Church will need to spell out much more clearly how the connection is made between the Church, what the Church believes is authentic sacrament, and those who are engaging in it remotely. And what, by the way, does any of this mean to the lone worshipper? More sharply, how is this personal bread, this privately arranged bread, the body's body. 3. A friend has mentioned a church congregation where the reserved sacrament is available for receiving at home. However that whole issue might be rethought by the Uniting Church, I find one powerful claim in it. It is without doubt the church's bread. And I think if we are to break our fast at all, whatever bread is eaten, I leave the wine aside as we may need to do, it must come from one ecclesial celebration. Because there is one bread, and we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. That was the point of the deacons taking bread to the absent in Justin Martyr's apology, and it was the point of the Didache seeds scattered across the hills and brought together and made one. Perhaps there's some relevance for the Uniting Church in looking again at its service, the communion beyond the gathered congregation. It doesn't quite apply, but it's worth pondering. In Victoria, we now have a general idea of when qualified normality might return. No doubt this eagerness has been driven by the commercial Christmas. The dates seem to be dangerously close. Our dilemma then still has some time to run. For many, as for me, the deprivation of the sacrament is hard. A weekly celebration has been part of most of my life and of my personal rule. I have chosen to fast, even though it's been imposed, but you can take up a sacrifice freely. In no way is anything I'm saying intending to lose my love for the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. The implications of our inert state for catechesis, for Christian initiation, and for evangelization are heart-stopping. What is the church in this situation? And is the next best thing adequate? The problem is that online communion is not really a thing at all. It is no thing. Not so much that a next best thing is not feasible, it is whether it is real. Now, our situation is extreme. Nobody had thought about it. And I grant that methods in extremis may sometimes be necessary to resolve such a question. The church has found ways to baptize without water and break bread on desert islands, but those are not the kind of extremes we face. We have people, presiders, bread and wine and water, but no true way to enflesh them. So I believe the Uniting Church must hold back from either media communions or communion at home, while COVID restrictions prevent us from gathering together physically. In conclusion, you've been waiting for it, I fear that there are many repressed objections among my listeners that come forward on the basis of your pastoral concern. I've known many a good doctrine set aside on the basis of a pastoral concern. People want to feel they've been to church. People want to see some signs of normality. People get something from watching, and so on. And let's be serious, as if the liturgy were for something. Worship, the liturgy, is our work for God, free, and all that we need follows. I think we need to rethink the service of the word for use on the electronic media. That doesn't mean putting up an altar table. My colleague, the redoubtable Doug Tasker, who was Christian television's director, regularly reminded me that on television I'm not addressing an audience, I'm speaking to one person. We have colleagues who are very good at this. If you venture, make sure that somebody's told you you can do it, because the media are merciless. Bible study could function well on Zoom with an opening exposition and directed conversation that you need to keep people's focus. It's also a wonderful tool for maintaining contact with the congregation, for post-liturgy chats and face-to-face with one other person. It's lots that can be done. And we need to pay further attention to domestic liturgy, whether it's a personal quiet time or a family prayer time, almost entirely disappeared from the Uniting Church, or that great gift, that treasure that Roman Catholics and Anglicans and the Orthodox have of a daily office, done with the skills that Kieran brought to it today. Let's remember all these suspended understandings when we finally return to our favourite pew and our people and our clergy and the music makers. Above all, please let us not just take up where we left off. Let's take a fresh look at ourselves as worshipping bodies and discern the gifts of the Spirit to be harnessed for the benefit of others. Let us not forget that those still exist who will need a media link with the church for pastoral care, catechesis, evangelization. But above all things, let us embrace with our whole body this precious gift of the Lord that we have lost for a time, and in every way honor it, give thanks for it, celebrate it, and receive it fully, consciously, and together. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for a wonderfully rich and thought-provoking presentation. I know that there will be many people who want to contribute in the discussions. So for the practical working out of this, I encourage you all to use the chat, and I encourage you to raise your hand, and as far as I can, I will try and make sure I give you an opportunity to speak. One thing that comes to me, Robert, out of what you said is the experience in my parish in the first 3 or 4 weeks of lockdown, where Holy Week was where we began our engagement with Facebook. One of the very first things we did in the parish on Zoom was on Annunciation Day, we held a call for prayer, which was prompted by a call from the bishops. And we only really gave about an hour's notice for the meeting, and we had a good number of people from the parish turn up. I mean, we're talking 20 or 30 people. And I think your conclusions draw attention to the broader functions of media in the wider and their wider application in the life of Christian community.
Yep.
I'm also interested in your opening questions about the role of theology and a theology of technology. Now, Tom Knowles is saying, what will the experience of online worship bring when we gather again in person? How can we take advantage of the experience?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Robert?
They were the few remarks I made at the end, by which time you were probably fast asleep, about the service of the word, about recovering things like the daily office, like teaching our people how they might pray together at home, those sorts of things. I mean, for sacramental worship, the loss of the congregation, the people together, is a total knockout, in my view. So we've got to leave that aside, in my view, and find other ways of doing it. I mentioned a couple of short steps towards achieving what we all want, but it will not take us very far until we are meeting together.
Indeed. Now, I see Peter Sherlock with her hand raised.
Good.
It's, thank you, Robert. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I've been cheering all the way. And just to add to that, if you start to think about how would you do a baptism online,
Yes.
do I sit here and pour the water on myself while you say the words?
Yeah.
It shows how stupid the whole idea is, let alone marriage. I'm sure that wouldn't be legal, or unction, or whatever, you know. So thank you.
Thank you.
And can I add on baptism that people who are sort of not regular churchgoers but want their children done will stop doing it. I think the gap between church and ordinary society is likely to grow quite rapidly.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to have explored the baptismal question much further. It's quite interesting that I've hardly ever heard the matter raised. But if it don't work for baptism, it don't work for Eucharist.
Doesn't work for the Eucharist, exactly. Yeah.
Nathan has raised an interesting thing in the...
Yeah, say a bit more. Say a bit more, Nathan.
Yeah.
Well, just making the point that most of what you said keeps saying when we return. At least hypothetically, for the sake of the theological exercise, what if return is 20 years away? What if this is a very long-term scenario?
Yeah, the 20 years will come in chunks. And we'll face it as we discover what the reality is. That's, I think, how it's likely to work. I mean, there are signs all across the world. There are people battling to find answers to this question. And it's our responsibility to continue to look at it as well.
Now, sorry to interrupt you, Robert. I saw Darcy Wood waving his hand a moment ago. So if he wants to unmute, I think there's a reflection.
Yes. In the videos that were sent before this meeting, I was impressed by what Carmel Pilcher said about during this time of shutdown, we are challenged to think again about how the liturgy of the word mediates the presence of the Lord and how people can share together in the celebration of the word. In our locality here in the Macedon Ranges, the recorded services are not presented just by one presider. They're presented by a number of people, and the word is read from scripture, but the word is also expounded by several people, and the word is also sung. So I think this is something to think further about. That I agree with Robert in general about the difficulties of sacramental worship when it's remote. I agree broadly with that. But the liturgy of the word is something that we can work on more, I believe.
In the last couple of months, I've had the privilege of seeing some of Nathan Nettleton's work with South Yarra Community Baptist Church, their online worship, which in some ways has informed the experience of worship we had at the beginning of this meeting. There are two things I'd like to do in the next few minutes. One is to give Nathan an opportunity to speak about the process and evolution of that model of worship. The second is that Bob Derenbacher has raised an interesting point about individualism. And I think it would be good to ask him to speak a little more about that. So could we go Nathan, then Bob, please?
Sorry, Kieran, I'm not really clear what you want me to do
sorry,
in my 30
Nathan,
seconds.
Could you tell us a little more about the online worship experience of South Yarra Community Baptists?
I actually wonder whether Robert might like to answer that question. Because Robert's experienced it semi-regularly for a little while, and he's got the floor. And so in light of what he's been saying, I reckon it'd be interesting to hear Robert's take on it.
Well,
Okay.
greatness is thrust upon one. I've always taken Nathan Littleson seriously. We've got a lot of parallel experience behind us, including the monastic community of the Transfiguration, formerly at Breakwater, now beyond Geelong, and their liturgies, which were very much based on a congregational ecclesiology, which of course Baptists share. So that what Nathan does, and it takes a tremendous amount of preparation. There is a standard liturgy, though it has, of course, like all standard liturgies, lots of variations in it. He has a choir, which produces a corporate voice of song, which people can sing along with or not as they wish. But every member of the congregation is invited to take one of the prayers, all of which can be found in a script, and offer it, and the readings and all the rest, so that, I mean, you have almost a total, the presidency has been almost entirely dispersed in the congregation. Though Nathan's a very subtle presider, and he does keep out of the spotlight most of the time. When something that requires the pastor there, the pastor is there. It is amazing the variety of skills, which some people might judge as rather poor at points, but I find them just as evangelical as those who have good BBC accents. So it's an ecclesiology that holds it together. And Nathan would argue that, well, he's free to disagree with this now, but we did talk about it, that in this situation, the whole congregation is, as it were, consecrator. And therefore, those at home with their prepared bread and wine are co-consecrators with the congregation. I'm not a congregationist, but boy, do I understand the theology of that. I can see it and I honor it. It does take a lot of work. It throws the accent back on the wordiness of it, I think, though the moment of communion is experienced as a solemn one. My criticisms of that I said earlier still apply, and on about the second occasion that I attended, I did prepare some wine, only the best, and some ordinary bread, and ate it and drank it prayerfully. But it was my celebration at that point. And incidentally, I won't use my ordination to celebrate privately in my house. That's not what the presidency is for. So, I mean, you know, hallelujah, keep it going. And there's all sorts of naughty Uniting Church people in the congregation.
Bob Derenbacher, would you like to come off mute?
By all means, I hope you can hear me. Thanks, Robert, for a fantastic paper, and thank you all. This is my first time being with this academy, so thank you for welcoming me.
Nice to see you.
Just first, I'd like to commend two articles that are in the Anglican Journal, which is in Canada. It's the Anglican Church of Canada's national newspaper. Two articles by Chris Britton, with 2 T's, and Chris is my counterpart at Trinity College, Toronto, and has written 2 excellent pieces on Eucharist during COVID, and I would commend them to you. Robert, my question for you has to do with virtual communion. And when I say virtual communion, I'm thinking specifically of, you know, having the wine and the bread in front of your computer screen as an individual. I'm just wondering if part of the problem is Western individualism. In other words, I wonder if non-Western Christians would be experimenting with virtual communion to the same degree we are seeing here in the West.
Yes, it would be good to have Carmel Pilcher at this point and talking about her experience in Fiji, where the community so completely absorbs, as it were, the individuals. I know the Pacific Islands moderately well, and I can see how that works. I've also seen it in Africa. I think you're right about individualism. I'm asking myself whether it only, or whether it's restricted to Western individualism. Certainly, it's individualism is the point of my attack when I come at it as an ecclesiologist. And it has to do with one's consciousness of oneself, when the primary consciousness should be ecclesial, theologically speaking. I don't know. I mean, have you any further thoughts on it yourself, having spotted it?
Well, I think sometimes I default to that as an explanation for life's problems that we're facing.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, yeah. I just want to make sure I'm not doing that unnecessarily here, but I've suspected that in this particular practice, which I agree with you is highly problematic and highly from a theological standpoint. And so I'm with you on that. I still am struggling with the live stream communion, which is different, but as you point out, shares a lot in common with the virtual communion bit.
I mean, there's a lot. Go ahead.
You've given me a lot to think about today.
There are other smoke screens in the way. One of them is our clericalism. Now, I honestly believe that our Lord intended there to be a ministry, a formal ministry within his church, and the apostles were the first sign of it. That is, a church without a ministry set aside for these church guarding and church developing tasks is a church with problems. So I'm not setting the clergy aside in their sacred role, but the fact that the clergy have been so alone in their exercise of their clerical role in word and sacrament has left us with a problem about the dignity of the baptized taking leadership. I don't mean invading the Eucharistic prayer or anything else that might be regarded as not on. I mean, the Uniting Church spells out quite interestingly in Uniting in Worship precisely what are the tasks the presiding minister should do, and it doesn't, because we don't have canons and we've avoided that kind of language, we've said it is the privilege of the presiding minister to welcome the people and do the opening greeting, to pronounce the forgiveness of sins, to preside at the prayer, the great prayer of thanksgiving, and to give the blessing. So we define those positions, and I think that they are also part of the presidential role. But for the rest, everything can be done by the baptized. I once I got to know the community of Grandchamp in Neuchâtel in Switzerland, which is the community that formed Brother Roger and the first These members. And they came in as presbyters of the cantonal Church of Neuchâtel. When they celebrated the Eucharist, and they asked me to take the presbyteral role at one point, and I'd been with them often, they invited me to come forward and sit on the chair for the moment. And then when it came to the Eucharistic prayer, they bade me take my position behind the table. For the rest of it, the presider was the lady who's called prioress. It was run by the community. The voices, the singing, everything was done by the community. when they required a representative of the Catholic Church, they called a presbyter in. I learned a lot in a few minutes. I don't know whether any of those things touch on you. The other cloud, the other smoke screen is our fear of magic, that there's something magical operating here, and that you know, electricity might be a replacement for something else in consecration. But I just leave that to cause you further confusion.
Now, we do actually have among us a representative of a very, possibly a very different perspective. Among us, we have the Reverend Nishad Isaac from Kerala, India. So first, let me say welcome, Nishad. What's been the experience of your church in India with COVID?
Thanks, Karen, for the opportunity. And it's been an honor to be a part of this lecture series. For us, we had the lockdown by the end of March, and we had 4 periods of lockdown, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we have unlock 1, 2, 3, 4. So from September 21st, we will be having the 4th stage of unlock. Since the end of March till now, we do not have worships in our churches. So what is being done, I belong to the Marthoma Church, and we are a Reformed Orthodox church. And what we have been doing is that our bishops have been conducting communion services on Sundays, and they have been aired over YouTube or Facebook for the congregations all over. Now, with respect to specific churches, depending on the context, whether it is an agrarian context or an urban context, depending on the context, the priests take an initiative to conduct communion services online, which are being shown over Facebook or YouTube or even Zoom. But the common difficulty which the congregations have been sharing is that we don't feel the real spirit while we were together, maybe 300, 400, 500, or even 1,000 people coming to a church one Sunday. So that fellowship, that engagement, we are not getting it right now. So it's a very spiritual crisis that we are facing. And also from the monetary aspect, like when we used to come to churches on Sunday, we used to give our share to the churches. So now the churches are also to an extent suffering in that respect. My question to Sir Robert is that do we need to reread liturgy when it comes to the online worships? The words used in our liturgy, which we chanted all these years, were meant for the congregation, were meant for us while we accepted it in the ecclesial context. Right now, while we partake in the communion from our home context or maybe in another place, do the words remain the same? Do the effect of the words, or do we need to reread liturgy? Thank you for the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishad. It's difficult for me to comment on a tradition so distinct. I might say the Marthomas are among my favorite church because they celebrate the liturgy with orthodox richness, and they preach like Martin Luther. Yes?
Yes, true. Yes, true.
Yeah.
I mean,
one of the issues is how central is receiving communion in the different traditions. In the other Orthodox churches, there'd be many who'd be perfectly happy to watch the liturgy celebrated online, and they wouldn't miss the fact that they did not receive communion that day. the Ethiopian church, when you go to their churches, you'll find people standing outside the actual sacred center of the church, alongside the outer fences or walls or by a gate in prayer, but they don't need to receive the sacrament. That within the customs and the courtesies of their church, that's not the thing. It's being with the church and close to the sacred. So, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that Martoma theology would support that very strongly, but because I would have thought that your people valued receiving bread and wine in their hands. So I don't think that words need to be changed. We just yes, I don't know how to advise you. Perhaps you should go and talk to your bishop.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Now, Chris Porter has very patiently had his hand raised for the last few minutes. So, Chris, if you would like to unmute.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. Sorry, I'm in the middle of dinner preparation as well, so I'm a bit scattered. Just one thing that I thought was interesting. I was having a chat with a pastor or an Anglican priest, and because of I won't name who it is, but anyway, they're from a subcontinental location, and they are currently ministering here in Australia, but also overseeing a congregation from their hometown. And his reflection was that the sense of distance that you get from being online, the consumerism that we get from being in front of a TV, was that it wasn't quite so distinct for his context. Rather, the level of spiritual communion was still present there. And I wonder if part of this is also then our attitude towards screens. Our attitude towards the fact that a screen is there for consumption, not just for communion. We very rarely do corporate and community things on screens up until now. We've tended to consume things far more often, and so it fits into that mindset for us.
Yes.
Robert,
I'm interested that nobody has yet actually talked at any length about spiritual communion. And if somebody is going to talk about it, I hope it will include a Roman Catholic, because I think there are two different views of spiritual communion. One is a kind of imaginative replacement for communion, and the other is an ecclesial theology of not receiving communion. So there may be others who can make a comment about that. I take it that when you said subcontinental, you mean the Indian subcontinent?
I did, yes.
Okay. My memories of India, and I've not ever been to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, are of billboards everywhere. And I would have thought that consumerism was just as alive and well in the Indian subcontinent as anywhere else. I mean, it's a plague. I may not be right on your question. If you were to rephrase your question, I may have another go at answering it.
I'll pass to someone else. I'm sorry.
Okay. I have a hand raised from Jim McPherson. What I suggest is if we let Jim ask his question.
Yeah.
And we do indeed have Catholics among us who may be able to speak to that question of spiritual communion, Robert. While you and Jim are interacting, I'll try and set a couple of people up. So, Jim.
Jim, you're welcome.
Sorry. Just unmuting.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation, and the conversation you just had with Nishad has encouraged me to speak of my experience, which I mentioned to Colleen O'Reilly this morning in a conversation on the phone, and she said, "Oh, there's an academy meeting tonight." So that's how this all happened. In the parish where I normally belong, the priest would run what we call the anti-communion service, up to the greeting of peace before the great Thanksgiving, and then she would give a blessing, and that was the end of the service. And to me, that I described that in my head as Eucharist interruptus.
It is.
And that's how I felt. Whereas I've been doing a locum in nearby parish, and when there were occasions when the priest, and this is before, and this is in Queensland where we've had a lot easier run than others. So there was a time when only the presiding priest could receive the communion. So there I was, standing at the altar as the preacher for the Sunday morning. There was the presiding priest, someone else, and the techie doing all of this on Zoom and Facebook and the like. And as the priest did prayed the entire prayer of consecration and received himself or herself, I was standing there next and deprived. Now, the interesting thing was I did not feel deprived. I did not need to receive the elements because I had been through that prayer of consecration in myself, which I had been denied in the other presentation, the Eucharist interruptus. And so I'd be interested in your comments on that, Robert.
Thanks, Jim. I think all of us have been forced to do a lot of inner reflection to help ourselves cope with the great absence in our lives. My comment on the Queensland replacement for the full Eucharist, and I'm sure Charles Sherlock was feverishly waiting to leap in, is how very Cranmerian of them, how very 1552. And I think even in 1552, it was provocative that that the Anglican form stopped, allowed the possibility of stopping at the ante-communion. I'm sure that Thomas Cranmer had a variety of reasons for moving in that direction, because he was most certainly moving from 1549 to 1552, and he didn't really have a chance to do much more after that. But there's no doubt in my mind, or in most liturgical historians' minds, that he was on a roll, and if Edward had lived, the Church of England might be very different. It may be very much more like the churches of Switzerland and part of Germany. That's a serious historical comment. I understand why you felt no need to receive communion in that situation. If a prayer was an inner prayer, I see no reason why it needed to force you to, or require you to receive the bread. I may have misunderstood something you said, but I think what you were saying was really a question about the ante-communion, or which in more modern terms we'd say really was a service of the word. In the Uniting Church, we consciously made the Sunday service a service of both word and sacrament, with the possibility, which is taken 9 times out of 10, of not proceeding to the Eucharist, but proceeding to a general thanksgiving, which was, as it were, dry thanksgiving, intercessions, offering, the usual thing, final hymns, blessing, and out into the world. Slowly, the Uniting Church has been celebrating more frequently, so that word naturally leading to communion is much more in our minds than it was 40 years ago. But ante-communion is particularly abrupt. Were we really talking about a Book of Common Prayer service at that point?
A prayer book for Australia.
Oh, okay.
But what part of my theology as it's developed is that it's also consecrating or reconsecrating myself to service and to stop in midstream when all the lead up is towards reconsecrating. It just jars.
Yeah. I think that the problem that that particular Anglican church has served up for you, and I wish you well in solving it.
Okay.
I mean, it is a very particular situation, and I hardly know of it anywhere else.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. I have 4 people in a line.
Goodness.
So I see Charles has his hand raised. And as we're heading slightly over our time, could I ask for this to be very brief? And after Charles, we have some reflections on spiritual communion from Sophie Morley, Colleen O'Reilly, and Tony Doran. So Charles.
I don't want to take the historical thing up, but Jim's point, I think, makes the thing that an essential element of the Eucharist, this is the more Catholic side, is not me receiving, it's the congregation's offering, anamnesis, the sense of, I don't mean the sacrifice of the Mass, but the proper sense, the sacrifice of praise of ourselves, and in some sense associated with the offering of the bread and wine. That's what you can't do online. And I think that's partly what Jim's missing. The second point I'd like to make is that the liturgy of the word, whether it's a separate service or anti-communion, that itself is sacramental. And you can't just, that has a sense of embodiment as well. And I can't imagine Robert disagreeing. But that's all I would like to comment on. By the way, in our town, the best thing that's happened is 7 of us from the 3 different churches each day ring the only church bell in town at noon.
Yes.
And that's been very helpful. It's gone on for 25 weeks now.
Okay, Sophie.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Robert. I was saying yes, 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 like many of other people, with all your wonderfully made points and your very deep sense of ecclesial theology. I think that's the thing that really strikes home with me during this COVID pandemic. I must say, I started to look at Mass online right in the beginning when we had lockdown in March. And I started to say that prayer for spiritual communion, and I only said it once, and that was it. I just could not cope with that whole tenor of the prayer. And then I stopped watching after the Liturgy of the Word. I actually stopped watching the live stream. I can't cope with the fact that this is just a viewing of a sacramental act. It's not sacramental to me because I can't physically be there. We're not together in community in a physical space. So I agree with all those comments about sacramental communion. But the other thing that I find interesting too is a colleague of mine who is involved with Team RCIA in the US has written a beautiful prayer when one cannot receive communion. And I like it much better than the spiritual communion prayer, which is really a throwback for when people didn't go to communion at all or once a year. And I just want to quote just the first a couple of paragraphs, if I could just crave your indulgence. This is just part of her prayer. My Jesus, I believe that even before I was born, you have been with me, knitting my very being day by day into the garments of your love, clothing me with grace every moment of my life. And on the day of my baptism, you poured your love into my heart through the Holy Spirit who unites me eternally to you. And then jumping forward, on that joyful day when I do receive you in the Eucharist, may I remember that this precious gift is still but a foretaste of the holy gifts that await your holy people at your heavenly altar. There with the saints and angels, we shall see you face to face and give you perfect praise forever. So there are a couple of elements about that I like. Firstly, it brings us back all to we're here because of a common baptism. So this ecclesial theology, I think, is incredibly important, and I think a lot of Catholics don't have that. They think it's just me and Jesus, and forget about, the sacramental or the presence of Christ in the assembly, which is something that when I do liturgical formation for parishes in my diocese, it's surprising. They'll be able to mention the presence of Christ in the other ways of, you know, that the Constitution on Sacred Liturgy tells us, but when it comes to the Assembly, a lot of them look very blank. So that's something I think that we have gone backwards on, and I really think the spirit of spiritual communion, on a personal level, does not help me. Anyway, I'd love to say a lot more, but there are other people talking, so I'll hand it back to you. Thanks, Kieran.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie.
Colleen.
I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I did pick up that people were not satisfied with the prayers for spiritual communion, and I've always understood that the desire for communion was the equivalent, and that if we desired the sacrament, though we were deprived of it, then we were indeed truly in communion. And so I wrote some contemporary prayers, which I won't try and read now, and the one that Sophie just read is lovely. I'll send them to you, Kieran, and you can put them on the Facebook page for people if they want to use them. That's fine. It was just providing prayers for people who were telling me that the trad ones were no longer working for them.
Emily Payne has also raised an interesting and I think important parallel point about whether the elements of the Eucharist are properly used if they're not consumed. I will actually put this one up on Facebook because I think it's a very provocative and very good question, and I look forward to talking to Emily about that. However, we are moving into overtime, so I've asked Father Tony Doran to speak about spiritual communion from the perspective of one who presides at Eucharist. And Tony, if you want to bring yourself off mute, I'd be very pleased.
Thanks, Kieran. Early in the lockdown, when we started to live stream Mass, I scrambled to find something for spiritual communion for the people in the parish, and went to Google and found the prayer of Saint Alphonsus Liguori. So yes, the language is of its time. Because we were struggling to learn all sorts of things at that time, I've never gone back and found another prayer for spiritual communion, but it's one of the things that actually joins us all together now in the parish as I'm celebrating Mass and the people are joining in at home on Facebook or YouTube. So I'm not sure of the rights and wrongs about that. I've preached about it a few times, that, and I realise that there's a real hunger for the Eucharist out there for the people, and that they can't at the moment receive. The other reflection, I think, before Vatican II, Catholics were used to praying in lots of different ways. One of the great things that the Vatican Council gave us was the greater ability to celebrate Mass by reducing things like the fast and language issues and all of that. But now it seems that the only way Catholics can pray is in the Mass. So when we can't have the Mass, we've forgotten how to pray in other ways. That's the other thing I'd say, just about Catholic worship at this time.
It's Kieran?
Yes, Robert.
Of course, it was we Protestants who always thought that our problem was just me and Jesus. I think one of the remarkable things about this whole question is that there's not very much difference in our divided traditions between where we find ourselves in this lockdown. I also wanted to say that for me, all the ways in which a Eucharist might be happening in front of me on screen simply intensifies my sense of loss. And there is no other way of coping with it apart from turning it off. The final thing I want to say is just a response to Nathan and what I'm going to do for the next 20 years. On the assumption that the next move will be less than total lockdown and allows some small gatherings to occur, it can't be beyond the wit of humankind to find a way in which from a central ecclesial celebration, bread can be taken to other people. It may take a bit of organizing, taken by another human being who is allowed by law to travel from one place to another, hygienically contained, no doubt, do anything but post it, anything but post it, and somehow still within the context, a kind of extended communion might provide some help. It's still not the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's been a very enriching conversation and one that raises a lot of questions that will undoubtedly continue to occupy us as COVID is part of our world. Before we end, two last things. Our next chapter meeting will be on the 11th of November, and I'm very pleased that I've been able to collaborate with my colleague from Alison Wish in South Australia to present a paper by Tanya Witwer from Flinders University talking about liturgy and pastoral considerations in a time of COVID, which goes to questions of how do we help our communities to recover from trauma. This is not quite where I thought the year would go, and it's a very important conversation. I think the issues that Robert has raised will undoubtedly resurface when we gather again in November. The video of today's meeting will be made available on Facebook as soon as I've got the video edited and put together and loaded up. And as we go our ways, let us join in prayer together. God of the ages, you call the Church to keep watch in the world and to discern the signs of the times. Grant us the wisdom that your Spirit bestows, so that with courage we may proclaim your prophetic word and complete the work you have set before us. Through your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us bless the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
And I look forward to seeing you all in November. Take care.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.